This is a lecture on the first of two texts written by Grace Lee Boggs, and this one was written together with her husband, James Boggs. She outlived him by quite a ways. The second text that we're going to read, Grace Lee Boggs' introduction to this book. So this is the book that we're looking at today, and it's the concluding chapter that I selected for you. So, as usual, I want to try and introduce Boggs's to you biographically and historically. I'm going to do that very briefly this time. For one thing, because we've already been looking at the historical period in which they become prominent, which is the Civil Rights period into the Black Power period and through it. So one of the key things about this text really is that it's a response to Black Power, to the Black Power movement, to its vision of revolution. It's a critique of that and suggestions about like what form revolution could take if that one isn't going to work out, and what form revolutionary organization and revolutionary cadres, meaning like groups of people, could have if the Black Power one apparently doesn't work. And that's what the Boggses think. But I also want to add in some wider material today, because I think both for this text and then for the one when Grace Lee Boggs talks, she gives her whole history, the history of her and her husband's activism, and this beautiful history of what happens to, I guess, leftist activism in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. She gives this beautiful history. But what becomes, and she talks at length about Martin Luther King. She becomes more and more interested in Martin Luther King. Both of these figures took part in the Black Power movement, so they were radicals. And as she'll tell you, they thought that King's nonviolent approach was, how did she put it, naive, that it was naive. But as she got older, and she lived to be 100 or 101 years old and died just a couple years ago, as she got older, she started to think more and more about Martin Luther King, and she did lots of speaking about him and so on. And when she writes about King, she also talks about Hegel. And this book, Revolution and Evolution, has a lot to do with Hegel. So I'm going to tell you a bit about Hegel and Marx and this idea about contradictions and overcoming contradictions. And then I want to just clarify what are their critiques of the Black Power movement and of 1960s radicalism in general, and where do they think that we can go. They're writing in 1974, so we are now basically up to 1974 in this class, and our next text, written by Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya and about Kenya, although he now lives in, or at least he did live and teach in Irvine, and that's 1980. So we're moving towards the present, and that's the whole point of the end of the class, right? We want to, I mean, I've been asking you to think about all this stuff in relationship with your present all along, but now we're actually following the history up to the present, and really what we're trying to do is to understand how our contemporary situation is formed, has been formed, is structured by the history that we're looking at. And we want to understand within that structure what are the contradictions, what are the problems, and what are the possibilities for, I guess, freedom and democracy. We've been looking at freedom and democracy in this class, and at this point you should see that there are two radically different ways of looking at freedom and democracy. There's freedom and democracy as they are pitched to us on a regular basis, where freedom and free trade, and at best, a kind of negative model of freedom, as Hannah Arendt gave that to us, is offered. And democracy means representative democracy, media democracy, a democracy where a very few people make legislation, but we know that they are put in office by big contributors, and that they receive often pre-made legislation from so-called think tanks, which basically codify and clarify the interest and the positions of corporations. So this variety, this thin variety of freedom and this thin variety of democracy, which of course rests upon the suffering and the exploitation of big portions of the world, that's one variety of freedom and democracy. And then there's another variety, which is wider freedom, like what Hannah Arendt had called positive freedom, meaning active participation in decision making about the things that immediately affect us. And she thought this had to be social. She thought this had to happen on a local level, and it probably would take the form of the establishment of councils, variety of councils. And then, of course, democracy. What is real democracy? Well, real democracy would be everybody really taking part in deciding what's going on around them, what's going to happen with what affects them. So these end up, freedom and democracy, in what I would take to be the real sense, they end up being extremely radical ideas. And I think there's an interesting contradiction that we are involved in, and I'm going to talk more about contradictions in a moment, a contradiction that we're involved in just because of the difference between real freedom and democracy and what we are told about freedom and democracy. So we hold on to, a whole lot of us, and I was raised this way. I imagine that I'm really stamped as an American in this respect. I was raised really to believe in freedom and democracy. I bought those things. But then the more I thought about it, the more I saw that we didn't have them. So America is a country where freedom and democracy are key values, are things that are repeated all the time. And yet the reality with which we're surrounded does not constitute freedom or democracy in any real sense. That's a contradiction. And those kinds of contradictions, they can produce problems for structures of control, and they can produce partial impulses towards revolt. This is the Marxist and Hegelian theory, which I'm going to give you in a second. Okay, so let me go back. The Boggses. So James and Grace Lee Boggs were like a power activist couple for decades and decades and decades, probably starting in the 1940s, extending through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Grace Lee Boggs died in 2015. They were involved in radical politics and in revolutionary movements. And come the 1970s, they started to offer radically different models about the path that revolution could follow. Now, early on, they were associated with C.L.R. James. They were friends with C.L.R. James. And that meant that they were, like C.L.R. James, pretty close to orthodox Marxists, but also committed to the centrality of black people, especially black American people, African American people, in the revolutionary process. You know, C.L.R. James had, of course, tried to emphasize, I mean, he is the one person most responsible for publicizing and bringing back into contemporary thought the Haitian Revolution, which, of course, was a revolution led by African slaves, carried out by African slaves, instituting a black republic. C.L.R. James and the early Boggses continued to feel that the black population of the United States was uniquely positioned to lead a revolution. Uniquely positioned, for one thing, in kind of like Fanonian terms, Fanon's terms, because they are the wretched of the earth, because they have been historically the lowest and most abused and most exploited class in the United States. And because of that, I think the early Boggses thought that the interests of black Americans were most closely aligned with the general interests of the working class. And this is one of the things that they thought sort of fell apart in the Black Power movement. But before getting there, I think James Boggs started to wonder about this stuff in the early 1960s. And if I remember correctly, the split between C.L.R. James and the Boggses happens in like 1962 or something like this. Basically, James Boggs starts saying, look, Marx's model of revolution, the whole thing about organizing the proletariat, the working class, its idea about taking state power, all these things, they were first offered 100 years ago from the perspective of 1962, and they must therefore be out of date. There's got to be a way to bring revolutionary thought up to the present. The Boggses, I think, now this is before Black Power, but by the end of Black Power, they're really rethinking the idea that black people should necessarily be the vanguard of the revolution. Now, of course, they should be involved. Oh, and by the way, James Boggs was a black guy. Grace Lee Boggs was an Asian American woman whose family was from China. Okay, so they split with C.L.R. James. They split, therefore, with the longest lived and probably strongest current of African American Marxist radicalism. Anyway, so they split with C.L.R. James, and then they get involved in the Black Power movement, especially around Detroit. And really, their work would be primarily in Detroit for the whole of their lives from this point forward. So we've talked about Black Power. They were committed to Black Power, and especially to the community development aspect. And they remain committed to this idea. The stuff that I've said reminds me in the Black Panthers of anarchism. The stuff that I think Bobby Seale in particular was interested in, bringing, and that James Baldwin talked about, and that Stokely talked about. They wanted black control of black neighborhoods, local control of local neighborhoods, and this on a number of very specific levels. Control over schools, control over police forces, stuff like this. And the Boggses were on board for that. So basically, this is where we're going to pick up. This text was written in 1974, and it was a very influential one. It showed up in a period where Black Power as a movement was being destroyed, or had pretty much been destroyed externally by the FBI and a whole network of government organizations which saw the Black Power movement as a real existential threat, and therefore sought to dismantle it, and did it, of course, through entirely extrajudicial means, and by means of murder and lie and extortion and all the rest. But the Boggses thought that there was also a way in which the Black Power movement had failed on its own. And they saw this as connected to a whole lot of power movements, a lot of resistance movements that showed up in the late 1960s and the early 1970s. So you have the women's movement, you have the Native American movement, and they thought, okay, this is all good that all these different groups are seeking empowerment and seeking to alter their situations, but something they thought had been lost, and the thing that they thought had been lost was the generality of the revolution. Remember, the reason that they thought initially that black people were positioned in the United States to be the vanguard of the revolution was that their condition, their demands, their needs most matched the needs of the general population. So they're interested in a general revolution, a general alteration of the system. But things did not go right, they thought, with Black Power, and we'll come back to that in a bit. And they also think that what happens by the early 1970s with the remaining resistant movements from the 60s is that they increasingly turn into special interest groups. They become groups who are interested in advancing the well-being, etc., of a certain portion of the population, but not of anybody else. So I'll come back to their criticism of Black Power, etc., and we'll finish with their beginning offerings as to what a new vision of an American revolution would look like. Because in 1974, they are still revolutionaries. They really do want revolution, but they want to re-explain, they want to rethink what a revolution would mean. And I would suggest that the ideas that they have about revolution and the ideas that the Zapatistas have about revolution end up being very similar, although the first thing that we read about the Zapatistas is relatively critical on these points. So let me go way back and offer some of the framework from which I think the Boggses are coming. And I'm not just like guessing on this. Grace Lee Boggs will say in the last piece of reading you have from her that she was very happy at one point to realize that Martin Luther King's favorite philosopher was Hegel. It seems like, and she says that, reading Hegel was a German philosopher from around 1800, writing just around the time of the French Revolution. Reading Hegel was transformative for her. It's also the case that Marxist theory is derived, not exclusively, but in largest part from Hegelian philosophy. In a lot of ways, Marx just took Hegel's philosophy and he inverted it. Okay, so I'm not going to give you like the whole Hegelian philosophy, but I want to tell you one basic central part of it, or maybe I'll give you a couple of things. So, Hegel was one of the first philosophers to really start thinking about history. Philosophers in the Western tradition before Hegel tended to operate as if history were sort of inconsequential. Not that nothing happened in history, but that nothing essential happened in history. And what Hegel started to realize was, models of truth, models of ethics, forms of government, they all change in history. And he started looking in history for some kind of logic, some kind of organic form of change through time. And that's what his philosophy is about, the process or the evolution of what he thought was human consciousness. That each of the different ways that we set up religious systems across thousands of years, each of the different ways that we re-understand what art is, each of the different ways that we set up governmental systems and property systems reflected, he thought, a degree of development of human self-consciousness. So he's totally focused on thought, on consciousness, on self-understanding, and he tended to understand these physical forms, the cultural forms, and patterns of organization of humans. He started to understand them, or he tended to understand them, as externalizations of spirit. What's driving things is ideational and cognitive awareness, like a kind of like blueprint, an evolving blueprint within the human mind and within the human mind socially, and then it produces these exterior forms. Now, what Marx famously did with this model was to turn it upside down and say, well, you know, I agree. Marx thought that, and I here is Marx, he agreed that something really essential was changing in history, that perhaps this process of change had a like goal. Maybe it was going somewhere. Maybe it was developmental. And he accepted these things from Hegel. And Hegel, the goal is ultimately perfect self-consciousness, understood primarily on a social level rather than on an individual level. He thought that's where human history was headed. Marx, he substituted for this ideational, idealist, cognitive telos. Telos is the Greek term for like a cause that is in the distance, a goal. A goal that, because we're seeking it, helps to alter things in the present. That's a telos. And we talked about systems that move in this way as teleological. Marx took that teleological system from Hegel, and he replaced the domination of the mind with the domination of matter. And he replaced the telos of self-consciousness with the telos of communism. A full communist society without government, somewhere off in the future. That's where all history is heading. And it's also, Marx thought, necessarily heading through a whole sequence of revolutions, which is clearly correct, and towards one final revolution which would introduce global communism. And of course we have yet to see if he was right about that. The failure of the Soviet Union does not prove that Marx was wrong, because Marx already thought that if a communist revolution was localized geographically, it would eventually be overcome by global capitalism. So he was actually right. That actually shows that he understood things. So Marx takes Hegel, but then he makes everything material. Instead of thinking that consciousness is guiding things, that ideas are guiding things, Marx thought instead that it's modes of production. It's the way in which humans are organized to produce the things that are necessary for them to live, and this changes across time. So he always looked at these basic periods. So you have, like the feudal period, which is followed by the rise of the capitalist class. And so with the rise of capitalism and the globalization of capitalism happening through colonialism, and then especially through the 1700s and the American and French revolutions, the general pattern of the organization of humans' time and labor and the use of resources and the development of technology, all these things change. So you can talk about different historical periods, but what's primary about them is material organization, material processes, processes of labor and extraction and distribution and valorization, profit taking, and property holding. All these things are material dimensions of human life and of history. And Marx held that these were the driving forces, and ideas lagged behind. Ideas at best just reflected what was going on otherwise. Okay, so I say all this stuff. So now you know that Marx got stuff from Hegel, and if you actually start to care about this stuff, then you can go read them. They're very hard to read. I think they're beautiful. I disagree with Hegel in a whole lot of ways, but it's still beautiful and intriguing reading. Philosophy can be invigorating, mentally invigorating. Anyway, there's a concept that comes from Hegel that Marx accepts directly, although he puts it on this materialist versus idealist basis, and which the Boggses pick up, and which Grace Lee Boggs seems to take as like really central to her understanding, and that is the idea of contradictions. Both Hegel and Marx thought that as human history advanced, it didn't do so in a just plain old linear fashion. it did so by the accumulation of contradictions. Now, in Hegel's version, ideas are driving everything. Thought is driving everything. And so, as human understanding advances, it encounters more and more contradictions. Hegel's version of history is basically like the history of philosophy. We were understanding some things, and the history of science. We were understanding some things, but philosophy is higher than science. We were understanding some things, but not all. And say we start off with, his favorite thing is start off with like rationalism. Rationalism, so we're talking history of philosophy here. So rationalism refers to Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, figures like this. They were trying to understand the universe. They were trying to explain what was real and provide foundations for science by looking primarily and even exclusively at structures of the human mind. But this doesn't work that well, right? Because the rest of the world is not just rational. And what happens with humans is not just based on the structures of their own mind, assuming that there are static, unchanging such structures. It also depends on a whole lot of random encounters with the rest of the world. So historically, the philosophical movement that follows rationalism, which is happening 1640 to early 1700s, is empiricism. Late 1600s, you get Hume and Locke, especially David Hume. And Hume and Locke wanted to explain human experience entirely on the basis of the exposure of human beings to an external world. So empiricism, meaning emphasis upon experience, emphasis upon that which is given in experience. And they thought that everything was built up out of that. And even things that look like structures of the human mind are actually derived from sensory experiences. So you have a real antagonism, right? There's a kind of contradiction between the idea that there are inbuilt structures in human beings that determine how we experience, and that there are not such inbuilt structures in human beings, but everything comes from outside. This is a contradiction. And then the most important philosopher between the rationalists and the empiricists and Hegel himself is Kant. Kant sort of takes the rationalist tradition and the empiricist tradition, and he puts them together. And he develops a model where there are inbuilt structures in human beings, but they only become apparent through experience. So this is it's not real important for our class, but this is how Hegel thought about contradictions. And he thought, like what any given thinker at a particular time is trying to do is work through all the places where the model that he or she is using no longer matches up with the reality that it's supposed to describe, that there are conflicts between what we understand and what we observe, or within the model itself. If a scientific model or a philosophical model involves contradictions internally, obviously that model is not quite correct. And as models break down, you can look at this for like the Ptolemaic system, that when they tried to understand the motions of the planets and the stars on the thesis that the Earth was the center of the universe, the model just got more and more complicated. You can actually do that. The Ptolemaic system was like really good, and here I'm talking like early Middle Ages, the medieval period, prior to Copernicus, of course, and Kepler. That system was actually really good at predicting the movements of stars and so on. It was science in that respect. But it required more and more nuance. The more carefully you wanted to explain the motion of a star, the more like details you had to add, and it sort of accumulated these contradictions. And that's why people preferred Copernicus' system, not necessarily because they were as yet convinced that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but because they wanted a slimmer, more functional model for predicting things. They wanted fewer contradictions. So moving forward in terms of knowledge seems to have a lot to do with the development, accrual, and then overcoming of contradictions. Okay, so Marx takes this model and then he puts it into the material dimension, and he starts saying, okay, yeah, I buy this idea about evolution. Evolution is not linear. The changes to human society, they happen through the development of contradictions and then the overcoming of those contradictions. But in Marx, these contradictions become physical. They become oppositions between, say, classes. They can be oppositions between speeds of development of technology versus speed of development of social relationships, which are mapped onto and work together with a given technological productive system. So he starts looking at physical things and asking about contradictions there. And this is where Grace Lee Boggs really jumps off from. Although I think she in particular, I'm not as sure about James Boggs. I've only read one of his books. But I think there's a kind of idealist bent, a tendency to think that things start with thought and understanding that becomes apparent in Grace Lee Boggs as she gets older, especially. The classic contradiction, I'll give you two classic contradictions in Marx, and I already mentioned one of them. The classic one is the contradiction between, which I just mentioned, between the development of technology and productive systems. So we know, of course, that this is something that happens in the period that we're looking at, right? So the Industrial Revolution happens from the late 1700s through the 1800s. It radically changes like the way that things are made, the way that the things that are necessary to human life are produced and distributed. The whole growth of factories, and then the development of the assembly line, steam power, and then electrical power, and all these things. This totally radically changes the way that we make our world. And it's really important from a Marxist perspective to realize that, like, if you look around, there's nothing around you that does not bear the trace of human labor. Like, we've made it all. And even if I look outside my windows here, I've got these nice trees and stuff. That's a eucalyptus tree. That's not local to here. Even, the organic world around us reflects human labor. Of course, like, we set up our whole garden. Like, if you look across my portion of Echo Park here, you see all these different trees, almost none of them native. Everywhere around you is the traces of labor. So the way in which we produce things develops really quickly. And Marx acknowledges capitalism is really good at developing technology fast, forcing technological growth. So we have technological development over here, technological and economic development over here. But we also have over here social relationships. Now, realize that social relationships, the pattern of social relationships, necessarily is related to the way that we produce, right? So think about, for example, in a factory, there are different jobs, right? There's foremen, there's, different specializations. There's the division between, people on the factory floor and people doing white collar work in the office. These are social differences, especially in the workplace. They end up, being differences of rank and order and all this sort of stuff. So a particular mode of production, a way of making things based on a certain development of technology, requires certain social relationships. And it can also change them, right? So when the capitalist class comes into power through the American and the French revolutions, all of a sudden, now the highest positions, control over the political apparatus, control over tax funds to develop infrastructure, all this kind of stuff is now in the hands of the capitalist class. That's a social change. Now, the bankers, the ones with the most money, have control over everything. They have a different relationship now with the aristocracy, the old aristocracy. Maybe relationships between men and women start to change. There are relationships between the general overall social pattern of society and the technologies and means of production that it relies upon in order to reproduce its life and to generate, in our case, to generate profit for a certain very small portion of the population. The classic Marxist contradiction is where the technology and the economic stuff grows real fast, but the social relations don't grow fast enough. And what he thinks happens in those cases, he thinks that's what happened in France in 1789. What happens as the social relationships lag behind the development of the economic situation, in this case with the growth of capitalism, but we're maintaining over here aristocratic social relations. What happens is that this contradiction gets tighter and tighter because this has an inertia, and this is like trying to hold on to the past. What's the result? How are these contradictions overcome? The result is revolution. Revolution is now Marx's way of thinking through the overcoming of local contradictions. By the way, he thinks that the movement towards the communist revolution is totally necessary, because this is really worth thinking about. In capitalism, we're developing, industrialized capitalism, and now communications and computer-based capitalism is radically changing the face of the earth, right? You can see the changes that the human population has made to the earth from outer space. I mean, we are an historical species who are irrevocably changing how the face of the earth looks. And if you think about what industrialization and the communications revolution has done to production, well, it's put in contact all these different portions of the world, which were less in contact before. They were put into contact violently through the course of colonization, and then they are integrated more and more tightly into a whole system for the extraction of resources, the development of component parts for machinery, the shipping and redistribution of those parts so that factories can be built, factories to make intermediary products which will be used in later products. I mean, there's stuff, signals, communications, resources, raw materials, commodities, and money going every which way across the face of the globe. Economics is the study of that. So capitalism has integrated the globe. It's also made it so that, say, like, what does Exxon do? Exxon does all kinds of oversight of all these different portions of the globe, right? So they have their extraction operations, they have their shipping operations, they have their refining operations, they have their distribution operations, they have their financial operations, which are like tapping into all kinds of other businesses. Exxon is a multinational corporation. It's an international, it's a global corporation. And that means that it's actually centralized the control over a whole bunch of productive processes. It's made it so that these different portions of the globe actually are integrated into one another. And the Marxist way of looking at this would be to say that, paradoxically, capitalism has therefore socialized production. It's always making the globe more and more interconnected. It's always making workers in one part of the world more in contact with workers in another part of the world, empirically, insofar as they work over the material that came from whatever other place. But there's a contradiction. So, capitalism is developing economy, but it's trying to hold old property relations in place. And now the old property relations are the capitalist ones, because production is becoming more and more socialized, but ownership, profit, valorization, the return of more money, which is what's driving this whole thing, that's privatized. That's kept antisocial. It's guaranteed to a few property holders. So Marx's view would be that the property system, which is a form of social organization, that's really important. Property is a form of social organization. It's not just something about me. It's about me in relationship with others. And we want to think about big property. Big property structure with the capitalists and the billionaires getting all the rewards as all of the rest of us work and increasingly suffer, is lagging behind technological communications, industrial development. And what's that going to produce? More and more contradictions, more and more obstacles, until eventually the very inertia of the system itself will explode and cause a revolution. This is Marxist thinking. Contradictions are really central. Now, here's another basic Marxist contradiction, which I mentioned before, and that is the contradiction between ideology and reality. So we live in a society where we're, told to take a look at the Declaration of Independence all the time. You want to know what America is all about? Take a look at the Declaration of Independence, and there you will find that we believe that all humans are equal, that they have certain so-called God-given rights, including, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and all this stuff, right? We are told that we are a country deeply identified with freedom and democracy. But then if you look into the actual alleged freedom and democracy that we have, it doesn't match those ideals. And there's something even more troubling, I think, which is that on the skin of it, I bet if I did a survey at the beginning of a class like this, you'd all tell me that you're for freedom and democracy. We're socialized to talk that way. But then as you go through a class like this, every semester, it becomes more and more clear that people don't actually believe in those things. You're afraid of them. We're afraid of them. So that's a contradiction too. Anyway, all of this just to say, the Boggses emphasize contradictions a lot. And there are a couple more that they emphasize that I'll draw your attention to. For one thing, they're like, okay, we're revolutionaries. We're still revolutionaries, even after the Black Power failure of the Black Panther Party, for example. Even after that, we are still revolutionaries. And the reason that they think that we have to be revolutionaries involves, I'll come back to this, but involves the connection between the United States and capitalism, the sort of stuff that I talked about in the Guevara lecture. But basically, they're just like, look, okay, in order to be a revolutionary, this does not mean that you should hate the United States. Doesn't mean that you hate the people of the United States. In fact, it probably means the opposite. The real question is whether the existing, this is where their text finishes, right? Whether the existing government, whether the existing system, which is also an economic and property system, whether it actually fulfills the needs of the population. And the claim is no, that the contradictions of capitalism have now gone so far that things are so tied up against one another, that the classes are in such increasing antagonism, that the existing system and government cannot fix the problem. In fact, they only make it worse. And that's real easy to see with the Trump regime, right? By the way, there are all kinds of contradictions, right? There's contradictions and oppositions, as I talked about before, within the working class. There's people within the working class who do not understand themselves to be parts of the working class. It has long been the tactic of capitalist owners to turn one portion of the working class against another. So there are contradictions, oppositions, structural oppositions between blacks and whites, between blacks and Koreans, between blacks and Latinos, between Asians and blacks, between whites and Asians, all these different structures. There are contradictions between men and women, for sure, structural contradictions, because what's good for men and what's good for women have historically been established as not the same thing, because women were put in an inferior position, and the ongoing supremacy of men depended upon their suppression. So this is a structural tendency to keep people in relationships of domination. These are all contradictions. And those are all the things that we can see blowing up now, right? I mean, I see more male versus female antagonism in my own community, in my own set of friends, in my own classrooms than I did 3 years ago. Certainly, there's way more racial tension apparent than was apparent 5 years ago. Maybe it's just a function of things being suppressed, but then maybe it's a function of movements like Black Lives Matter making things apparent. But making things apparent also draws them into greater intensity. It escalates the contradictions, and the radical revolutionary standpoint has tended to be, okay, let's augment the contradictions. Let's let things get even worse. From this perspective, Trump being president is really good for the revolution because it makes things worse. It draws tensions to a head. And when tensions are drawn to a head, perhaps that's when revolution and structural change can happen. And then the other specific thing that the Boggses talk about that is a contradiction is they think, in general, capitalism has been technologically, economically, extremely dynamic. It has, under this system, so many changes in the way that we live have happened, including the fact that I am talking to myself in a fucking room, pretending that you're here, but you're not. Including, then, the fact that you are sitting in front of a computer and it's as if there's a professor talking to you, but I'm just an image, and you can pause me anytime you want. All kinds of changes in the very fabric of reality have occurred and are still occurring. And yet, and here's where they're with King, where Grace Lee Boggs in particular is with King. And yet our ethical and political practices have not in the least kept pace with technological development. In fact, what we've let happen is that we've let ethics and politics separate from one another. So as I go through this class asking you what are basically ethical questions about political issues, I sound a little bit weird or utopian or something. Because we all know that what goes on in politics has everything to do with economy and corporations, but really nothing to do with ethics. Of course, there's game playing with ethics and propaganda and political speech making and all this sort of stuff. But I think generally speaking, we know, doing politics and trying to be ethical are two pretty different things. That's a big contradiction. That's a problem. Another way to look at this, or another contradiction, I suppose, is the one between this highly developed technology and economics and the very ideas that we have. What they mean by this is that we're still holding on to old ideas about what it means to be progressive. So, liberalism is a problem. What do they call it? Something like humanitarian liberalism is a problem. Because it may have been the case in the 1800s that thinking about, the lower classes and giving charity and stuff like this was, advanced behavior, or starting to recognize, hey, like, all people should be basically the same, but they're not. But now this old idea about liberal humanitarianism, they think is backwards. Giving people charity and thinking about people as needing charity keeps them in the position where they need charity. And what was at some point in history progressive thinking is now actually reactionary thinking. So in general, if our ideas don't keep pace with changing times, we will have ideas, and therefore our practices will be guided, I suppose, on this view, in a reactionary fashion. We'll have reactionary ideas which guide us in a reactionary fashion. Reactionary means like attempting to keep in place old structures. So we need ideas that are up to date with the current situation, which do not make victims or recipients of charity out of the oppressed classes, but which somehow or other figure out how to empower them. So we need to overcome these contradictions. And one of the reason that I see this kind of like bit of idealism in the Boggses is because what they are recommending is the formation of revolutionary cadres, groups, which engage in community activism and in theoretical study. But the primary function of which, or at least the way they talk here, seems to be to project ideas, to cause people to think differently, to try and get people to stop being materialists not in the Marxist sense, but in the typical sense that we in the United States mean. Materialist can mean two things. On a philosophical basis, being a materialist means believing in material things before ideational ones. Marx is a materialist. I'm a materialist. But then materialism in the everyday American vernacular, which you're, I'm sure, familiar with, means liking commodities a whole lot, wanting to have jet skis and a big house and stuff like this, a lot of money. They want to cause people to rethink these things. And it seems to me that they're thinking that if people's ideas, if people's consciousness is changed, then it might be possible for them to go on and change structures around them. But you have to start with the ideas. And in this sense, they strike me as idealists. And I'm not sure if I agree with them, but I would definitely hang out with them. I would definitely, involve myself in these kind of projects. Anyway, so let's go back to Black Power. So, the historical significance of looking at the book Revolution and Evolution at this point in the course is that it's written in 1974, and it's written by people who took part in the Black Power movement, and they had criticisms of that movement. Now, one of the criticisms I've made already, and that is that they thought that while the movement for black autonomy, while the black revolutionary movements coming out of the civil rights period initially had a really generally revolutionary possibility, meaning that they had the chance, they had a position, a structural position, accidental, historical, structural position, where they could have led a large-scale revolution of the whole society, try and overcome capitalism, and with it racism and etc. But instead of doing that, Black Power got more and more interested in African American and then African people. It became a special interest group. And at that point, they sort of lose conviction in that movement. So they explicitly drop the idea that black people should necessarily be African American people should be the main vanguard of the revolution. They ditched that idea. They're like, it looked possible in the 60s, but it's no good anymore. Black Power is just another special interest group. It's trying to do what's good for black people, but what does it care about Puerto Rican people? What does it care about gay people? Very little about gay people. And this moves over to the more specific criticisms they have of the Black Power movement. They're like, look, that movement, oh, and by the way, I should say, The reason that I include so much stuff on Black Power, and I have a lot of interest in that stuff, for me, this is the last generation of people, with the exception maybe of certain small groups in the late 1990s, early 2000s, who really seem to have had the courage to attempt things that are truly revolutionary. I'm with the Boggses. I think there has to be another revolution. There's no avoiding it. Now, whether that revolution is going to be like a fascist revolution or a socialist one or an anarchist one, a failed one, a global one or a local one, all these things, remain to be decided. But things cannot go on as they are. This is how I feel. And so I look at this history and I see people with courage. And I find that tremendously uplifting because I think we have lost that. I think people are really committed to the idea that, well, there's nothing we can do to change anything anyway, so we're just gonna let shit be. That's pathetic. The Black Power movement was the opposite of that. People took real risks. They made real sacrifices. That stuff to me is uplifting. But I do think that a number of their criticisms of that movement are correct. So they spend a lot of time talking about, like, okay, they think it's unacceptable for people in the United States to identify themselves with the colonial oppressed. Now, this is one of the things I've been trying to develop through this whole course, right? Like, I think we should be thinking about a potential alliance between the wretched of the earth, the exploited people of so-called third world countries, and the exploited people of the first world. I think that kind of alliance has got to exist. And, the Black Panther Party was... they were reading Fanon, and they were interested in thinking of black communities as being very much like colonized communities. Now, the Boggses think that this is a dead end, because their problem is like, well, look, as much as ghetto communities in the United States have trouble with the police, etc., it nevertheless remains the case that they live in a certain way, and with a whole bunch of commodities and so on that people in the third world just don't have, and they live with that level of comfort and distraction and whatever it is because of the vampiric, exploitative relationship between the United States and the rest of the world. So I think it grosses them out. They increasingly find it repugnant to hear people in the United States say, hey, we're colonized. Now, I'm not sure I agree with them on that one. I think there is some value in pointing out the similarity between colonized people and some populations within the United States. And I would even go further than that and say, well, there's a whole bunch of ways in which the majority population is probably colonized. But I see their point. The points that I have an easier time with is that Black Power movement was in large part misogynistic, which is weird, especially if you look at the history of the Black Panther Party, because that party for the majority of its existence was run by women. But there were these like photogenic and prominent, well-spoken, media spectacular personalities who showed up at the beginning. And I mean Huey Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, who was terrible to women. I haven't read Soul on Ice, but I understand that in Soul on Ice he even admits to rape. Eldridge Cleaver maybe was a rapist. So there were these dominating men at the beginning of the movement who end up either going into exile, Cleaver, or into prison, Newton, but they still hold this sway over the Black Panther organization. And one of the things that sort of destroyed that organization in the long run was just the amount of money that was necessary to deal with Huey's court costs and all that. Even though women played a really important role in the Black Panther Party, they nevertheless encountered sexual harassment, glass ceilings of different sorts, all the way through the history of the Black Panther Party. And in general, black nationalism and black power was male-centric. Grace Lee and James make the comment in passing that it may be that the Black Power movement inherited structures of rule from like the Black Church, which historically has a lot of male leadership and a lot of misogyny. Anyway, the Boggs' point is like, that's no good. We can't accept that. There is this sort of anarchist principle or prefigurative principle, which says if you're engaged in revolutionary activity and you want to move towards a different society, you ought not to do what the Marxists and Leninists would have you do, which is engage in rigorous hierarchy and violence in order to achieve non-hierarchy and peace. Rather, you ought to attempt to establish the structure that you want to see now. Well, if you want an egalitarian society, you cannot allow misogynistic and patriarchal structures to form your organization. Everything is lost if you do that. Also, the Black Power movement, and this is a problem that I do personally have with the Panthers, they made themselves a top-down organization. You know, they modeled themselves to a good degree on like Maoist lines. So they had officers and they had soldiers and they had people who followed orders, a lot of following orders, a lot of trusting people at the top that they are special somehow, that they've really thought this through, that they know what's going on. And this means a consequent disempowerment of the people towards the bottom. The practice, go back to Arendt, the practice of freedom was reserved for the Central Committee. And what was learned by the rank and file Black Panther was obedience and a whole lot of sacrifice. A whole lot of committed people were handing over their whole salaries to the Black Panther organization. So these are problems with the Black Power movement. They want to move, the Boggses want to move past it. But they are still revolutionaries. And in 1974, they're saying, why should you be a revolutionary? Well, you should recognize it's not about hating the population. In fact, you have to love the population. You have to love America. You have to love the country. But in a different way than the straight lip service that everybody else gives it. You have to actually wish for a better country. You have to wish for a really better life for the people here. But the reason that any ethical person on their understanding has to be in favor of an American revolution, another American revolution, is the tight relationship between the United States and global capitalism. So that whole model that we just laid out with Guevara, and that we'll see again sort of operating in Kenya with Tiongo, where the United States is the center. They call it the citadel, meaning like the fortress for global capital. It's the place where multinational companies have the deepest roots, where they have the most power, and very importantly, the United States is the military wing of that capitalist world order. Because that exists, we have to desire and we have to work for a revolution. I agree with that, by the way. The way that she puts it, or they put it, capitalism is a cancerous growth on the face of the planet. And we who are at the center of that cancerous growth have an obligation to overcome it. We are vampires with respect to the rest of the planet. We are involved through our taxes, through our silence, through our implicit acceptance. We are involved in these tragically violent and destructive maneuvers that happen across the face of the globe in a locked maneuver between economic exploitation, access to resources, access to labor, access to markets, the interests of the capitalists on the one hand, and the behavior of the military on the other. We're stuck in this. This is our thing happening. So we need a revolution. But, and here's one of the key changes that happens through and towards the end of this course. What a revolution is, what we should understand by the term revolution, is now starting to change for the Boggses. They're like, if you ask most people, what do you think about a revolution? What's a revolution mean to you? What is a revolution? Well, they think of the old Leninist model, a coup d'etat, the taking over of state power. That's what historically, through most of the 20th century, was meant by revolution. But now, approaching the end of the 20th century, the Boggses, and we'll see this again with the Zapatistas, and again in Rojava, and you can also see it in Occupy, and you can see it in the anti-globalization movement. Revolution no longer necessarily means that. On the one hand, we can talk about dual power situations. We can kind of leave the government alone. Although the Boggses aren't saying that here. I think they still think that we're going to have a conflict with the government. But what they want, what the Zapatistas will want, is to grow power on a community basis, to grow power locally, not to organize an army that is going to take over the state and put in place what? Just some new leaders. That's not what we want. So let's rethink what revolution means. Now, you'll see this, you can see this in the No Promised Land chapter in 1974, but you can see it even more in the last Grace Lee Boggs text that we'll read from 2008. She's thinking more and more and more about Martin Luther King, and she's thinking more and more and more about changing patterns of life. That's what she wants to do. We have to, because there's this real opposition between the development of our technology. I mean, we can blow up the whole world many times over. We can produce enough food to feed everybody on the planet. You know, technological development is fine, but political and political and ethical development is way behind. So we have to work on this. Capitalism, historically, go read the Communist Manifesto, but I think this is true and we can see it even more today. Historically, it breaks down social fabric. It breaks down social relationships. It takes pre-existing relationships and it just mangles them, rips them apart. You know, so Marx already in 1848 was able to write about how capitalism rips up families and it rips up old forms and it rips up aristocracy. You know, it does. Totally changes social relationships. But what it tends to put in place is isolation. You know, it wants individuals isolated from each other. And this is one of the historical alliances between the United States and capitalism, our individualism. You know, that individualism corresponds to capitalist function. Every man for himself, every woman for herself. Let's all just like go get the most money. And, you know, if you want, you can sort of believe with Adam Smith that everything's going to turn out for the best. But it hasn't. What has happened is that social fabric has been broken down. Relationships between people, the practice of relationships, the practice of ethics, all these have been broken down. And so the Boggs' variety of revolution, their solution to this problem, is to start building ethical communities. Start building, rebuilding relationships between people and relationships between people and their environment. This is where they want to go. Okay, so I guess I'll leave it there. My questions to you, I guess, would be, what's your thinking about the movement from the Black Power, the shift from the Black Power movement to what comes after? What does the failure of the Black Power movement show you? You know, globally, 1968 is like a huge year. This is the year, and we'll see this again when we read Grace Lee Boggs and when we read Mancias, The Twilight of the Revolutionaries, where he's talking about the historical run-up to the Zapatista movement. 1968 is this like final sort of explosion of revolutionary forces globally, and then they're being squashed. We'll see that in Mexico. Happens in the United States with COINTELPRO, happens in Czechoslovakia where the Soviets roll in with their tanks. State forces just squash revolutionary forces on a global scale in 1968. And in philosophy, there's a response, which I think I see echoed here in the Boggses, which people refer to as the ethical turn. Philosophers start thinking like, oh man, maybe we can't just change the world on a revolutionary basis. Maybe we have to change it one by one, like moment by moment, on an individual or on a local basis. And we have to start thinking about reconstructing relationships, practicing ethics. Now, from a real revolutionary perspective, I think the ethical turn in philosophy, it looks like retreat. It kind of looks like a shame. And when you read Mancias, you'll see sort of something like that attitude. But I think the Boggses have real faith in this. So I guess there's another question. Do you think that changing ideas can change practices? That's the one that I said that I'm kind of skeptical about. I'm not sure I buy that. I think maybe you have to change the practices first. And then the ideas will follow. That's a more hardline materialist position, philosophical materialist position. What do you think about the idea of local experimental life forms, community gardening, community co-ops, community this and that and the other, where we practice building the kinds of relationships that we can see are just. So in the Boggs's projection for the American Revolution, and this is a term they use a lot, right? They are projecting ideas. They understand that's a key function of themselves as revolutionaries, to make us be able to discuss this stuff. Like, hey, what about this? And their projection, it can't be black power anymore. It can't be red power. It can't be, the American Indian movement happened right at this time. That's cool, but they still see it as like too narrow. Can't be just Native Americans. Can't be just black people. Can't just be Asian people. Can't be just women. Can't be just gay people. Can't be just disabled people. And all these movements were happening at this time, and they're good, but they're too narrow because they don't address the entire system. They don't address capitalism and its linkage with militarism and colonial and neo-colonialism. So there has to be a composite of all these different types of people, and we have to start establishing communities where we practice treating one another with respect, where we practice non-hierarchical relation. If we don't want misogyny, we got to practice empowering women. If we don't want hierarchy, we got to practice horizontal democratic decision making. If we don't want pollution and degradation, we got to practice cleaning our neighborhoods. If we don't want like big agribusiness and the nasty way that they farm and the massive amount of like unnecessary transportation and packaging and all this stuff, then we have to do farming on a local basis. They're looking for like a full revolution, which extends across the very fabric of life. This is what they're agitating for. So I guess my question is just, what do you think about that vision? Does that vision sound plausible to you?